Now my 3D render has finished. I've got a whole sequence of frames that represent my movie file. I want to sort of compile them together and make a movie out of this sequence of frames. And I think I've got a little bit of sound as well that I want to add to it. So I've opened up After Effects. After Effects, we've got a composition window. So this is where we see our scene or our document. We've got a timeline at the bottom. There's nothing in here at the moment. And over on the left-hand side, we've got what's called a project bin, where all our files, graphics, all our assets are stored. So the first thing I want to do is I want to import my file sequence that I've just rendered. So I'm going to right-click in this project bin and go Import File. Now, even though we've rendered a whole sequence of individual frames, I don't want to use this Import Multiple Files that pops up. I just want to use this import file, and I'll show you why once this pops up. Okay, I'm going to navigate to where my render is. I put it on the desktop in a folder called MoText Render. I can see here's a whole bunch of sequential image files, the PNG files. These are my renders out of Cinema 4D. What I want to do is just select the first frame. Now, what you should see, if your options button has been pressed at the bottom left of this import window, is there's a tick box that's automatically been turned on that says PNG sequence. If you've got a whole bunch of individual frames that are sequentially numbered, After Effects will detect them automatically. So all you need to do is select the first frame, make sure that sequence has been ticked, and if it has, hit open. So what After Effects is going to do, it's going to treat all those frames like a single movie file, and that's exactly what we want. Now the first thing we have to be really careful of is After Effects, its default preferences. So I've imported my frames. Here they are in my project bin. It's a PNG sequence. If I select it just by clicking on it once, there's a little wee thumbnail which will give me a preview. Nothing's on mine at the start, so it's just black. What's important is it tells me the name of the sequence, the resolution. It also tells me the frames per second. And you should, if you can read this, you should see that the frames per second is wrong. It will say 30 frames a second. After Effects doesn't know that we work at 25. It's designed or built and engineered in the Northern Hemisphere in America, and they work on 30 frames a second. It's actually 29.97, but 30 frames is close enough. So before we need to do anything, we have to tell After Effects we want to work at 25 frames a second, not 30. So the way that we do that is we right-click our sequence and we go to this Interpret Footage option and click on the main settings. So Interpret Footage is getting After Effects to interpret what's happening with our footage. The important thing is we want to assume a frame rate of 25 frames a second. Now, unfortunately, you're going to have to do this every time that you import stuff into After Effects because the preferences are kind of locked in and we can't change them on these computers. If you've got After Effects on your own personal computer, you can go into the preferences and change it to default to 25. Because of the way the software is set up on our institution, we can't change that here. There's one other thing that's really important that we need to be aware of here, and that is in this Interpret Footage settings, there's an alpha channel option. So I remember I talked about alpha channels earlier. An alpha channel is a mask or a transparency, and we rendered out of Cinema 4D with that alpha channel turned on. Now, After Effects can detect that as well, and I don't know what it's got on yours. It may have pre-multiplied turned on, it may have straight, I'm not entirely sure. What I'm going to do for now is I'm going to set that to ignore the alpha channel. So we're going to look at our movie file with no alpha channel, and then a little later on we can check it with the alpha channel just to compare. So I'm going to hit ignore for the alpha channel and hit OK. One thing you should notice, once you've hit ignore, we can now see the background in that little thumbnail. Okay, so there's our footage. We want to make a composition. A composition is a timeline with all our graphics on it. Now, what we want to do is we want to make a composition that has the same settings as our footage. We want it to be full HD, which is 1920 by 1080. We want it 25 frames a second. The easiest way to do that is to grab this bit of footage that we've already got and drag and drop it onto it's a little hard to see, it's a film strip icon, it's like a little frame, it just looks like a square blob now because, well, it does on my screen. That's the Create New Composition button. If we drag and drop our footage onto that button, it will make a new composition with the same settings as our footage. Okay, I'll go through this quickly, then I'll go back and go through it again. Okay, so I dragged and dropped my sequence onto that new composition button, so now we can actually see this composition. We've got a timeline. Here's a layer of our graphics in this composition. There's a playhead that we can click and drag, and as we scrub through, we should see our movie reveal itself in our composition. Excellent, looking good. Now, what I'll just quickly do is have a look at our alpha channel just so that we can see how that works. At the moment, we're seeing exactly what we saw in Cinema 4D. There's our 3D text and there's our physical sky. It's a gradient horizon type background. If I right-click my footage again in my project bin, if I go to Interpret Footage and into the main settings, exactly the same way as I did last time, if I tell After Effects to use what's called a pre-multiplied alpha channel, what that does is it cuts out my 3D object from the sky. So if we want the lighting effect, but we actually want to put our own background in there, we can tell it to use this type of alpha channel. Pre-multiplied with black just means that you've got a solid color in the background already and assumes it's black. So the important thing is, in this interpret setting, we can choose whether we're going to use that physical sky background or whether we're going to ignore, or if we're going to use our alpha channel by setting it to a pre-multiplied alpha channel. Okay? It doesn't matter too much if you're not sure what this pre-multiplied thing means. All you need to know is that it cuts out the background so that you've got your 3D objects on their own. I'm actually going to use this alpha channel because then I can show you a couple of other things. Okay, so the animation still works, but it's just that it's cut out now, and this is actually a transparent background. The way that we can see if it's transparent is there's a small grey checkered box underneath the composition window. If you turn that on, you see the normal transparent background type background that you'll get in Photoshop, I don't know, probably a bunch of the other Adobe programs. This indicates a transparent background. If we wanted to put our own color into the background, we can create what's called a solid. A solid is just a solid color. So I can go to my layer menu, create a new solid, layer, new solid. I can pick a color for it, any color that I want. And I can hit OK. Now what this will probably do is create your solid as a layer on top of your footage. You can click and drag in the After Effects composition timeline, and you can reorder which objects are on top. So the layers in After Effects act exactly the same as layers in Photoshop. So we talked about layers in Cinema 4D earlier. They're not like this, but in terms of After Effects and Photoshop, layers work pretty much the same.